Okay, this lecture is going to be a little bit complex. There's going to be a lot in it, so I want to start out with just giving you an overview of what we're going to do. We're going to be looking at the components of a synthesizer. The main one I'm going to be using for demonstration is Serum. Many other synthesizers have the exact same components to it, but they're laid out very differently. We're going to be looking at the oscillator, we're going to be looking at the amplitude section, we're going to be looking at the frequency section and the modulation section. In the modulation section, we're going to use envelopes and low frequency oscillators to alter something in these first three areas. So every time when we start to look at these different sounds we're going to make today, I want you to be thinking about these four basic components right here. The pitch, how loud it is, the overtones, and how we're modulating them. So when we come over and we look at a synthesizer like Serum, we're going to set a basic waveform in our oscillator, and then we're going to use these envelopes to modulate the amplitude and the frequency over time. Later, we'll add in some low frequency modulation of those, but for the most part, we're going to focus on how do we use envelopes to create these different types of sounds: bass sounds, percussion sounds, accompaniment sounds, lead sounds, and some effects. We're going to start the whole lecture, oddly enough, with kind of these accompaniment sounds in between plucks, pads, and sweeps. And we're going to use the information that we learn when we build those sounds to make bass, percussion, and lead sounds. We are going to take the song that we previously put together and we are going to synthesize our own sounds for it. So we've created MIDI, we've put it in lead, accompaniment, bass, and rhythm parts, although my rhythm part here is still audio. So I've got this track right here. I'll hit play real quick just to refresh you how awesome it is. Got a lead melody over the top. An accompaniment part with good voice leading and a bass part playing the root notes. All these are long held pads, about a measure long for each in the accompaniment and the bass. We could throw an arpeggiator on the accompaniment part, but first I want to talk about some of the synth sounds that we'd use, because how the accompaniment part plays is going to change depending on the synth sounds. Why don't we dive into the kind of accompaniment sounds, which are mainly in this area here: plucks, pads, and sweeps. Pads and sweeps are longer, slower sounds, and so they would go better with longer, slower notes. So what we have right here in the accompaniment part is a long, slow note. If we were to put an arpeggiator on that accompaniment part, it would create shorter, faster notes, which we probably would move towards plucks. When we say long and slow, we're talking about the envelope. We want the envelope to be longer if we're playing a longer note, and shorter if we're playing a shorter note, obviously. So let's go in and see if we can't make a pad, and we may add a sweep onto that pad sound. Well, what is a pad sound going to look like? What I'm going to do, I'm going to use Serum. Okay, and I'm going to open Serum here. So we can go down and look at a pad right here if we want, and start to look at some of the qualities of pad. And the first thing you'll usually notice when you have a pad is that the envelope starts slowly and releases slowly. And you'll notice that the attack time is very slow. It's almost a second in this, and the release time is very slow. Let's try hitting that and see what it sounds like. So to build my own pad, I'm going to go into here. I'm going to load the init preset in Serum. You can do this in any of your synthesizer too. Find the most default you can, and you're going to create your own patch here. That's how my pad sounds right now. It's pretty harsh. Why? The sound is coming up all at once and dropping down all at once. The attack is very short and the release is very short. The first thing you want to do with the pad is slow down the attack and extend the release. In Serum, that's going to look something like this. I should mention that the envelope one in Serum is automatically linked to the volume, okay? Well, not the master volume, but the level of the oscillators. So we don't have to route the envelope to anything. It will automatically map against amplitude. And that is the case in most synthesizers because it's going to be about amplitude. But when you hear that pad sound, you realize it isn't just about how the amplitude starts and stops. It's also about its sustain level. So why don't we bring a slower sustain level here? And what you'll start to hear now is there's a little more attack on the front end. And say if you were playing a violin, when you first get that string going, it takes a little bit of time, slow attack, whoops, and the initial sound will be a little bit louder than the sustained sound, right? So here we have an A, D, S, R. We're going to skip hold for right now. We don't need it in this case. So. And I might shorten my decay a little bit on that. Might bring my sustain up a little bit. Now I might decide I want it to be even slower now. Well, listen what happens if I do a really long. I actually kind of like that envelope that I arrived at right there. I've got a very slow attack and a medium high sustain and a long release. Okay, with a relatively slow decay. It's about a quarter of a second delay. In addition to amplitude, I'm also going to have frequency issues, right? So kind of set the baseline envelope for the amplitude. Now we need to move into frequency. This is a pretty harsh sound, and I think I want it to be softer for this song. So I have my oscillator right here. I have just a single waveform in the oscillator, and I'm hoping you can see this is a sawtooth. In Serum, you have to go under analog basic shapes here, I think, by selecting basic shapes and then changing the position in the wavetable. And that's a little complex, but I can pick. You'll see here I have a sine, I have a sawtooth. It's a little strange how they display it. That's a triangle, a square, and an offset square, a PCM modulated square. Okay, they have one extra complex signal there. So if I change just the oscillator, I can get different sounds on my pad here. And obviously, the fewer overtones that are on it, the softer it's going to sound, or the less harsh it's going to sound. So let me go ahead and put an EQ on my pad sound, and let's see how it sounds with these different, just by changing the oscillator. So I've changed the envelope, now I'm changing the oscillator. Here we go. Now if I change to, and you'll see right away, just with changing to triangle, I have a different sound. I might be done right there. If you threw some delay and reverberation on that, that's a pretty nice sound right there. The accompaniment part is fitting in very well in the accompaniment range. We know the bass is going to be down around 100. We're between 200 and 500. It's a perfect area for this to be. Square fills it out quite a bit more. You can hear how much room that's taking up, right? With all those overtones up there, we're not leaving any room for our lead part. We're going to have problems from an arrangement perspective with our lead part. But let's say I like that square sound, that kind of hollow, fluty sound back there. Then my next step is filters. So I've shaped the envelope. I've picked my basic waveform. Now I'm going to move to filter. And if I want to get rid of high frequencies, I'm going to pick a low pass or high cut filter. So these are all called low cuts, they call them right here. And you can see that I'm on low cut 12. Which you should know by now is it's not the steepest filter. The steeper filters are 24 and above. You can see how that rolls off the frequencies really fast there. 18, not quite as much, 12 less, and then 6 is hardly rolling them off. So why don't we watch this with my square wave? I'll hit play and we'll see how much we roll off those high frequencies. Even with 6, it's quite a bit, right? You can hear that. 12, 18, 24. Now, by the time I've done that, I've basically ended up with my triangle wave again. I don't know if you remember that a square wave is a square wave is a triangle wave with the high frequencies cut off. So that triangle and that square look really similar now. I filtered too much off. There's no point in putting in a square wave and filtering off all the high frequencies. You might as well have just put in a triangle wave. So again, my ear is drawn to that kind of darker sound. I think I'm going to go with the kind of like that sound right there. I've created my first pad sound. Now, the next thing that usually will happen in sound in the real world that we mimic in a synthesizer is that the frequency spectrum changes over time, much like the amplitude spectrum. So we've changed amplitude using envelope 1. We've picked the frequency spectrum with the square wave, and we filtered some of that off to make it darker. But what will often happen is we will change the amount of filtration over time. Okay. So to do that, we were going to use another modulator. Now, one simple way to do it, and that's used a lot in synthesizers, is the same envelope that modulates the amplitude can also modulate the filter. In Serum, you simply grab the envelope and you drag it on to the filter cutoff right here. And now this filter, when this filter goes up, this cutoff frequency is going to go up. Let's see what happens. Okay, you hear that? So that sounds different than this, where it's not modulating. Hear that? Okay. When we route this envelope up to the frequency cutoff filter, we can adjust how sensitive that cutoff filter is to the envelope. When it goes 0 to 127 here, it's going to go from 0 to 127 here. Watch this. maybe I don't want it to be that extreme. I want it to move in this pattern at this time, but not that extreme. I can decrease the sensitivity, and you'll see right here that now that filter will only go from here to here. Listen what happens. Okay, so opening up the filter slowly over time is a very common pattern in pads because it makes the introduction of the sound softer, leaves space at the beginning here for the bass, the drums, other sounds that are hitting, and the pad kind of fills in the space behind it. Now, we might not like our filter opening at the exact same time that our amplitude is coming to its maximum level, so what will often happen is we can use a second envelope for the filter. So why don't we do that? I'm going to remove the modulation of this cutoff filter from envelope 1, and I'm going to go to envelope 2, and I'm going to modulate that cutoff filter. Now in Serum, you can see a little bit of the envelope 1 in the background there. I don't know if you can see it. So I can shape my envelope 2 kind of similar to envelope 1 here, right? And here I could mimic and get almost the identical sound. Let me turn the sensitivity down. But let's say I want the sound to stay brighter even after it comes in. I can keep my sustain level higher on envelope 2 than it is on envelope 1. You see that? Okay, or I might want it to get darker, but over a longer period of time. Or I might want it to get bright right away and darker as it gets louder. So now my envelope 1 is going to take longer than envelope 2. So right now here I have two envelopes, one modulating the amplitude, the other modulating the cutoff on a filter over a square wave. If I wanted that sound to be brighter now, I could simply change this square wave to have more overtones, which means change it to a sawtooth, right? If I want more overtones, I can start the cutoff higher. If I want more overtones, I can make the filter not as sharp. If I want to emphasize that cutoff, I can create more resonance right here, resonance at that point. Another thing that happens in pads is that you often will want to have a chorusing effect, meaning making it sound like there is more than one instrument being played at once. Similar to a choir, if you had 5 people singing at once, it sounds different than one. Most synthesizers will have a unison or voice setting somewhere in there. And what you can do in this one is you just simply grab this and drag up, and now we have 2 voices going once. And we'll make them slightly out of tune from each other, and you can set that detune amount with the detune button right here in Serum. Most other synthesizers will have something similar. So if I play this now, you can hear the sound very strong left and right, right? It's a little too detuned. I'm going to go ahead and bring that down. And maybe I want more voices. I can add more voices. This is what I'd like you to be able to do with pads. Having a slow amplitude envelope, some sort of envelope shaping the frequency cutoff over time, and the ability to have multiple voices on whatever waveform you choose. Now what I'm going to do for mine is I'm going to just brighten up my pad just a little bit here by bringing the cutoff fairly high at this point. See? I'm letting a lot of the overtones through at this point, right? Now, often what happens is because we've done that pad, we've left room at the front end of the sound for something else to come in, and that is often a pluck sort of sound or a shorter wave form. It's no different than, say, a harpsichord and a cello playing together. The harpsichord can help emphasize the attack while the cello maintains the sustain. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to add, so I'm going to call this accompaniment, and we're going to duplicate this track, and I'm going to call this one pluck, and we'll call this one pad. It's very common that you end up with plucks and or pads in your song. Now plucks very often will be shorter sounds, so an arpeggiator is a great thing for a pluck sound. So let's listen to just that accompaniment part if we put a arpeggiator on it. Okay, so I've thrown that arpeggiator on here, and I still have my pad sound in my synthesizer right here. And then when I hit play, you'll hear it's almost hard to hear it. And part of that is that the notes are playing so fast that by the time my envelope gets all the way up to full amplitude, it's moved on to the next note and it can never hear it. So one of the things I can do is simply shorten my attack time. I should be able to hear more of the sound. Let's see how that works. Okay, so the first thing that a pluck is generally is something with a fast attack, and it generally has a fast release too because we want it to turn off by the time the next sound comes on. Let's go ahead and build a pluck sound. We'll go into load the init here, the initial preset, and you'll hear. That's our default sound. The sound comes on 100% and turns off 100% right when it starts. And probably that sound right there won't sound too bad with the accompaniment we've already put in. Let's hear how that sounds with our pad sound. So it sounds great with the accompaniment part, but you'll hear that it's definitely stepping on the toes of the lead part. And part of that is the frequency response of the pluck. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. And you'll see that way too many overtones in that pluck. See that? We can't have that at the same time as our lead part. And we know we've got the right notes. Our fundamental frequencies are down 2 to 500, but we're stepping on the toes of our lead. So let's get that out of there. Let's figure out how to do that. Well, the obvious way, if you have frequencies over the top that are bothering you, is to filter them off. Try doing some of that. And somewhere in there, we can start to hear all three sounds pretty clearly. It's still a little distracting though. So let's change that pluck sound a little bit more. We want it to pop out in the beginning, but not as it goes. So we actually want to let more amplitude and frequency at the beginning and then have it, like a guitar string, start to mute off pretty quickly. So plucks will have a short attack. They'll have a fairly short decay, and you can get away with no sustain and just use the release, right? So let me go ahead and say, the decay is instant on this, but it's got a little bit of release. Give it a little delay. It's just a little bit. Hear that? So what I've done right now is I've taken this sustain all the way down and I've increased the release time. How long it takes to get from that loudest point to the point where it's releasing is the decay time, which is going to be pretty short. If I get short enough, I'm starting to get percussive, right? So this pluck sound is in between a drum sound and a lead sound or a pad sound. Hear that sounds with the rest of the music. And it's just nicely going on in the background there, right? It's not just, I can hear that lead pretty clearly. I can hear all three parts, which is our goal. If you're going to add parts to your song, you want to be able to hear them, right? That's the idea. Say we like it, but we want it to pop out just a little bit more before it gets out of the way. We can do similar things in terms of shaping the filter. And often when you hit a sound, pluck a guitar string, or have a percussive sound, there are more high frequencies at the beginning. The low frequencies take a little longer to get going. So often what we'll want to do is let high frequency through at the beginning and reduce that high frequency as the sound continues. What do we do to do that? An envelope. That's what envelopes are for, is for shaping those sounds. So let's go ahead, let's just drag our envelope 1 over to that cutoff filter. So we're using the envelope 1 to control the amplitude and the cutoff frequency of our filter. We can increase the amount, that sensitivity of that filter. We can increase the steepness of it. We increase the resonance. And we gotta be careful. If we're gonna wiggle this filter around the entire frequency spectrum and add a bunch of resonance, bringing our attention to it, we're taking our attention away from our lead. So we have to be careful that we're not doing that, right? Pretty extreme. I'm trying to make it so you can really hear it there, but you can hear all three parts, right? You hear that pad in the background? A pluck in between, and the lead still over the top. So there, we've just done a quick pluck by controlling these. Now we could also control that filter with envelope 2 like we did with our pad, but we can also change our underlying waveform if you want. Let's hear how some of those other ones sound. You can hear that hollow square sound, right? I kind of like this offset PCM. I'm having to be real careful though. I'm not stepping on the toes of that lead, right? So there's an example now of a pluck. You'll see pluck, we have short attack, we have very low sustain, in fact, no sustain, and we just are using the release. Okay, we've covered pads, we've covered plucks. Let's just talk about sweeps real quick. What's a sweep? Well, a sweep just means that we're modulating something slowly over time. We can use envelopes for sweeps, but a lot of times sweeps are done with low frequency oscillators. Okay, so we want to see if we can get this pad to evolve over time and not just starting with each note. An envelope is going to get triggered every time you play a new note. So the longest this could last for us right here is a measure, because we are playing one note per measure. Sorry, let me get into the pad. We're playing one note per measure. But what I want is something that's going to last over multiple notes. The way to do that is to use an LFO. Now, LFOs can go very fast or very slow, and why don't we look at both? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this LFO, and instead of using envelope 2 to modulate the cutoff frequency, I'm going to use the LFO. So I'm going to remove the envelope 2, remove all modulators. I'm going to drag LFO over to this cutoff filter right here. You'll see right now that there's a little line moving through here, moving through this LFO, and all synthesizers will have something hopefully showing you how fast your LFO is. Now, Serum's got a great LFO interface, which is why a lot of people like to use it. Well, one of the things we're going to do right here is just change the rate. We're going to say, you know what, let's have this LFO go up and down every 2 bars. And then I'm going to need to increase the sensitivity to that too. Here, so here we go. You hearing that? How it's brighter there at the 2 bar measure. Let me even go to 4 bars. At this point, I might want to shorten my attack time. Now, what will probably happen is you probably will have both. You will probably have envelope 2 and the LFO modulating that. They work together, they add together here. Again, in this program, you can control the amount that each one is affecting it here. So if I want the envelope to have the primary or less effect, I would move this left and right. If I wanted the LFO to have maximum effect, I could move it all the way. So you can see here it's tracking where the LFO is. The sound should get darker here. Right? As this envelope is moving back and forth across there. So that's kind of a sweep sound, something where I'm making it last multiple measures. LFOs can also go the other direction. If I really wanted this thing to go fast, I could mimic, let's say, vibrato, or I could mimic tremolo. So let's say if I took this LFO2, I could bring it to the level of this waveform right here. And then say if I wanted to tremolo, I could go really fast. I could say like, you know, hey, every 16th of a note, make this volume louder and quieter. You hear that moving there very quickly. So LFOs can be fast. Or slow. This LFO can be routed to almost anything up here, okay, by dragging and dropping. I could change the pitch slightly, the fine pitch right here. Okay, so low frequency oscillators are used when you want to control the sound separate from the note on and off values. Now they can be set to re-trigger every time you start a note. We could do that, but it's still not an envelope, because an envelope will play through according to the note on and the note off. The LFO will, once it gets started, it just goes, and if you stop playing the note, it might start again if you have this on the next one, but it doesn't necessarily have to complete its cycle. LFOs can get really trippy when in applications such as Serum, where you can start making all sorts of different shapes of them like this, and in fact they almost become sequencers at this point. Bright there, and then dark there, because it's a 4-bar cycle. Look how long it takes to get through. This is looking at the sequencers, this is not looking at the note on and off volumes. Okay, so when you're thinking sweep, you're thinking LFO. You're thinking vibrato and tremolo, you're thinking also LFO. A fast LFO versus a slow LFO. Let's go into bass sounds, see if we can produce a bass sound. And of course, everybody loves the 808 bass, so why don't we put an 808 bass on our song? To do that, I think I will pick another synthesizer for you, because what I'm trying to show you is how you can use different synthesizers, but they have the same concept across them. So the Logic has this one called ES2. This screams late 90s, of course. Okay, so if we want an 808 sound, what we have is a lot of low fundamental frequency, not a lot of overtones. So I'm hoping that everyone would know that is a sine wave sort of sound. So we need to look at this messy looking synthesizer and try to find where are our different sections here. Well, we can see right here is the oscillator section. Filter section right here, it is nicely labeled. Amplitude output section here. This has a clunky but very powerful routing section right here for the modulation section. And down here you see there's LFO1, LFO2, and 3 envelopes that go through here. I'm just going to reset all these. And I'm going to start out by picking, I'm going to go all the way just to one filter here, and I'm going to pick that sine wave that is the fundamental part of a 808 sound. And you can hear I'm already pretty close, right? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do a couple things that are an important part of that. One of them is when you first hit the attack on a sound, there is usually some sort of high frequency information, but also, like, imagine if you're hitting a drum head, not only there's more thwack when the stick hits, but the head bends a little bit, and so the pitch comes up a little bit. And what will happen at the beginning of, say, an 808 sound is it'll have a little bit of pitch bend in it. So what I want to do is actually modulate the frequency of this sine wave just a little bit at the beginning, okay? To do that in this synthesizer, I have to go through a bit of a rigmarole. I have to say, you know, I want to modulate pitch 1 here, and I want to modulate it with an envelope, so it's a little higher pitch right at the beginning. Well, envelope 1 is pretty much always linked into the amplitude in the synthesizer, so I'm going to use envelope 2 to modulate that pitch a little bit, okay? And so my source is going to be envelope 2. You'll see it's already set up there. And I don't need a via. That's another level of synthesis that we'll get to later. So what I want is for that to bend that pitch pretty quickly at the beginning and then stop bending it fairly quickly too. So it's more of a boo sound. And to adjust the amount of pitch bend that's going to happen, I need to bring this fader up here. And you can hear as I adjust the decay that it is in fact changing that pitch pretty significantly. You hearing that? And you'll hear right there, if I bring it right there, it starts to get that 808 sound, doesn't it? That's actually not too bad of an 808 sound. And one of the things you want to do with your 808 is keep it real simple. Now, sometimes you can add some high frequency over the top of that. So let's say we want to bring in kind of a percussive sound. We would probably use some noise over the top. And in this synthesizer, there's no noise in Oscillator 2, but there's in 3. I can see it kind of hidden back there. So let me turn on 3, add a little bit of noise to it. Now I can hear that there is too much noise going on continuously, so what I need to do is filter that noise. So it starts with some noise and then I filter it off. Well, I've already got that filter for the pitch right here, envelope 2, so I'll just take envelope 2 and I will route it to pitch, or to the cutoff frequency of the filter. We'll go cutoff 1 right here. So it is going to go to that. So this is going to pretty quickly bring down that filter frequency. We could increase the amount of it here. We can add more of the high noise by mixing with this thing. You hear that bright sound right at the beginning? There's an 808 sound. More sustain on it as well, so we can actually... And there's that 808 sound. It's pretty easy. So there's how we make an 808 sound. We've knocked off a lot of sounds here in this hopefully kind of quick lecture. Okay, so now we're going to do some percussion sounds, and percussion sounds are short, fast sounds. So we know when we're getting ready to do that we're going to be looking for fast attack, fast decay, and probably fast release. So what I've done here is I've taken this song and I'm put down a hi-hat, snare, and kick track here. This was the rhythm track I had before. I'm going to try to get rid of that. I'm going to start with the snare sound right here. And let's go ahead and open up a new synthesizer. We're going to open one called Retro Synth. Now, Retro Synth is it's a great little synthesizer. I think if you have Logic, you should really get to know this one. So let's take a look what we're going to do. I'm going to create a region here. I already have it. And in that region, I'm just going to put some snare hits here. And when I hit play, it's, let's see here. Doesn't sound much like a snare, and why is that? So let's go over here and take a look. We have an oscillator section, we have a filter section, we have an amplitude section, and then down here we have our modulation section. These are automatically routed. There's not a big routing mechanism in this synthesizer. That's actually what makes it the most simple. The amplitude envelope is already hardwired to the amp section, and the filter envelope is hardwired to the filter section. Now you can set how sensitive the filter is to the filter envelope right here, but you can't route this envelope anywhere else. And then your LFO section can be routed to your filter by increasing the sensitivity here, but it can also be routed over here to the oscillator via what's called vibrato. And vibrato is just, as we covered in the pad and sweeps area, vibrato is just a type of LFO, usually a fast one, while a traditional LFO is slower. So let's get into making a percussive sound. We're going to start with the snare sound, and if you hear a snare sound, you hear a lot of noise in there. Well, that's a good hint for us where we should start. So we're going to come over here, and we have two waveforms we can pick in the oscillator section, A and B here. And we're going to start by having a lot of noise, and that's what this shape is right here. That's the noise shape. And we can control how much of 1 and 2 we have. So when we started this sound, we had a sawtooth. If we want that to just be noise, we can switch there and right away. And there's our sound. Now, we're close to a snare sound, right? Got some noise in there, but there's more things happening in a snare, and let me show you some techniques for how to get those. One is the envelope, so let's go ahead and just shorten that attack and decay times there. So let's hit play again. And that made a big difference right there, you hear that? But a snare has more than one sound in it. It's got the snares underneath, and we've imitated that with that white noise, but it also has a thump sound to it when you hit the skin of the drum, and it has a tone to it. It's a fairly low tone. So we need to add in a tone with the noise. So we're going to have the noise in the top, and we're going to add a tone in the bottom. To make it simple, we're just going to go with a sine tone, and in this synthesizer, there is no sine. The closest you can get is triangle, but that's fine. You can just filter off the triangle if you need to. So let's go ahead and add in a little bit of that triangle wave, and then I'm going to mix it in a little bit here, and let's see how this sounds. And you hear it there? Now that sounds like a really, really, really high snare. Well, we can play with that. So let's come down here and we'll pick the notes and let's start to move them down. Now, one thing you can do is you can open up an EQ and you can watch where that fundamental frequency is of that triangle wave right there. You see it? Now, most snares are down around 200. So let's just change the pitch that we're playing, the note that we're playing, move down until we're around 200. Maybe a little bit lower than 200. Okay, we might want to give it a little more decay, more time in the decay. Not that much. And we're starting to get that snare sort of sound. The next thing, after we've messed around with our amplitude envelope, is pretty much always we're going to play around with the filter envelope. Let's see what we can do with that. So we'll turn it on, and we'll do some low passing, and we're going to make it very dependent on the envelope. So let's crank the envelope up here, and we can guess that our envelope is going to have a fast attack, probably fast release, and short sustain. So I'm going to start to move these around as it's playing. Let's go turn the volume up here. Give it just a little bit more sustain on the envelope, and maybe a little more release. Let's see here. Okay, and now I can change that where that filter is, right? Maybe a little more noise. And I'm getting to that snare sound, right? That's getting pretty close to the snare. Now, one of the other things that happens when the snare hits, there's a higher pitch right at the beginning because the skin is being stretched. When we play around with the 808 bass sound, we have some of the same considerations. Is when that noise first starts, usually our ear wants to hear a little bend at the beginning where it's higher frequency. Well, in this synthesizer, you do it over in this auto bend thing here, and if you have it on a glide, it means it's going between two notes, but if it's on auto bend, it means every time you play that note, have it bend a little bit, and so we're going to make it bend a fair amount. We go to the right here, it'll actually bend down, and then how long is it going to take. So listen what happens when I move this. Takes a little bit longer, and if I slow it down, you'll hear that that's an important part of the snare sound, right? Is that little bit of pitch bend at the beginning, okay? And that's basically how we make the snare. We got a little bit of noise in the top and a fundamental frequency underneath. We're going to move to kick. The idea is very similar. Let me just jump down here to the kick. We'll solo the kick track. Let me get a retro synth on it. And then what I've done is I've gone ahead and I plugged in some kick notes down here. You'll see right here. Okay, so I'll hit play on those. And they sound like notes right now. Why? Well, I'm playing a sawtooth wave. So let's go ahead and set it up similar to the snare. We know we're going to want some noise at the top and we're going to want some fundamental frequency underneath it. Probably on kick, we're going to want more fundamental frequency than we did the snare. We're probably going to want to filter off more of the highs. We can assume that we're going to have something similar to the snare here in the amplitude envelope because it's a drum, right? We want it to hit quickly. And we can also assume that there's going to be some high frequency at the beginning that is going to cut off as it goes. So let's go ahead and play that. And we've created two snare sounds now. I don't know if you can hear that. They sound identical. Well, they both sound like snares. So let's go into this kick here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the frequency response, and I can see it's hitting up here between 100 and 200, which is the typical range for a snare sound. So I'm going to take those notes and I'm going to move them down. And we're going to get down to kick range, which is 60 is about the best range for kick right in there, that area right here, okay? And you can hear a pretty noisy sounding kick. So that sounds too noisy, right? So let's go ahead and crank the volume up a little bit. I can hear that the noise needs to be filtered off more after it hits, and I can see I haven't made the sensitivity to the envelope come up yet, so I'm going to do that. Got a little too much okay, and I can hear that there is too much note going on there, so I'm going to give a little less noise. Now I'm also going to put in some of that bend right at the beginning here, so let me go ahead and add some depth. Not too much. I don't want it to... See, the decay time on drums is often about 100, right? Somewhere in that area, maybe a little less for the kick. Pitch is still sounding a little high to me, so I'm going to go ahead and knock it down a little bit. That's getting me down at the 60 hertz. A little low there. So I'm basically creating a kick sound, right, from scratch, and I can get it in the exact frequency I want, the right amount of overtones. The question is whether I want to spend my time doing this when someone else has already done a lot of it for us and we can pick specific kicks. But you can see we can really get powerful with how we line up the kick and the snare in the song, right? We can pick that exact spot we want it to be. So if we didn't have enough low frequency information in our song, you know, we could move the kick down a little bit. You know, I could adjust it right here in the semitones too, right? I can. And this is not EQing, this is synthesizing, right? If I wanted more high sound, I would just turn the filter over. So you can create all those different sounds by synthesizing it, not mixing. So I'm going to open up retro synth again. And for hi-hat, it's almost all noise, right? If you make a hi-hat sound with your teeth, you don't use your vocal cords at all, right? Which means that all the sound is just noise. So let's go ahead and put noise on oscillator 1, and we'll go all to oscillator 1. We know it's going to have a short attack, short decay, short release. In fact, we can probably set it up similar to the snare sound that we used, right? We may not even use the filter envelope because we want it to be high the whole time, and I don't know if we'll use auto bend. Let's go ahead and hit play and see what we hear. Okay, so we can hear that hi-hat. We can open up the EQ on it. And we can see that there's white noise going across the spectrum there, right? Pretty much every time it's playing. I can shorten that decay. Really tighten it up, right? Kind of if I wanted to get that, say, trap or hip-hop sound. Now you'll notice it sounds kind of dirty, and that's actually because there's a lot of low-frequency information in here. And we can clean that up by adding not a low-pass, but a high-pass filter. We can turn that on right here in retro synth, and right here I can say, give me a high pass. Let me try one of these. Try creamy. You see I'm actually going in the opposite direction there, right? So I'm doing the high frequencies. It depends how high I want it to be or low I want it to be, right? So now I can bring my song back in if I wanted. And I've got my own kick, hi-hat, and snare going, right? I might decide now, you know, oh, I want that hi-hat higher. So then I go in and I synthesize the hi-hat higher, right? Or maybe I want it trashier. I might want it longer. Maybe I want more brightness on my snare. Am I mixing or am I synthesizing, right? The lines are getting blurred. Right, maybe more noise in the snare. Maybe instead of the 12, I only have or 24, I have a 12. Making that snare really pop. Maybe that's too much, right? Maybe then... Maybe I want the snare to sound like it's ringing longer. Almost sounds like reverb there, right? So I'm using synthesis to mix and produce my percussion sounds. Right now I want to get into lead sounds. And lead sounds, the idea of them is that they are mimicking the human voice. And they actually make use of all the other techniques we've had. They make use of some sustain that we would have in a pad sound. They make some use of the pluck sound. They make some use of the percussion sound where the pitch changes quickly at the beginning of the sound. The human mouth is basically the greatest synthesizer that's ever been, and it has all the components of a synthesizer that we're using here. The oscillator is our vocal cords. The distorter is our teeth. The filter is our lips and tongue, right? So we can go and make sounds, which ultimately we hear as language. So when we get into this lead part, we want to start to mimic and hold people's attention by mimicking the full capacity of the human voice. Well, easier said than done, right? It takes a lot of work to do that. And to become an excellent synthesist on the lead part is harder than in all the other parts combined. Really, we saw it was pretty easy to do, especially the 808 and kick, snare, and hi-hat parts. Even the pads weren't that hard and the plucks weren't that hard to shorten them. Lead, it's going to take a lot more work. Now, one of the things we're not doing here is we're not doing effects yet, and effects are really important. We're going to follow that up as we get into mixing. Now, the line between synthesis and mixing is getting blurred, right? And we were just showing that as I was building these kick and snare and hi-hat sounds that I was synthesizing them, but using the synthesizer to mix them in the right ranges. So everything now is mixing at the same time. Let's go into lead. We'll pull up a serum here, plug in, and we'll go ahead and play just through these notes. Now, there's nothing better than a sawtooth waveform to really pop it in your face, and that's what we got going right here, okay? It's nasally, it's pointy, it has lots of overtones. If we look at the frequency spectrum on it, it fills it up here in the top, okay? And the biggest problem usually is that it's annoying as heck. So how do we soften that? Well, we filter it, okay? So let's go ahead and might have filtered a little too much there. I'll go ahead and keep this up here. Now, once I've done that, I want to use some of those same techniques. I'm going to shape the envelope a little bit to a more natural sound where it has a little higher attack level and a sustain level. Although, like, you know, with the lead sound, sometimes you can leave the envelope kind of shaped like this. We're going to try to do some of the same kind of shaping of the filter using envelope 2. So I'll go ahead and drag envelope 2 over there to the filter, and we'll start to play with that. I'm going to see if I can get this sound to shape and sound a little more natural rather than just a piercing nasal sound. Let's see what happens. You can hear just with the lower sustain. A little longer release. I'm lengthening the attack on the envelope a little bit so it opens more slowly. Now that might have softened it too much, right? Let's say I like that. I like that kind of almost French horn sounding flute, whatever it is. So, okay, so the next steps from that, once I got my basic envelope shapes is can I thicken it, and how does it change between the notes? So to thicken it, what we can do is we can add additional waveforms onto it, and we've got other oscillators in Serum here that we can add. One is just a whole second oscillator with the same options of waveforms that we can go into. We also can add a sub-oscillator and noise to it. Why don't I start with a sub-oscillator, and I'll just show you what that does. I can bring in this case, it'll be a sine wave. I can control the level here, and it could be like an octave lower. You hear it down there? I might bring it an octave higher. Makes more of a metallic sound. Now in this synthesizer, if I want that sub to go through this filter, I have to turn it on here, right? Okay. Let's say I want a little attack on it like we learned in drums. Why don't we add some noise? We'll put some noise in. You have to go to white noise here in this. And what I might do is say, hey, you know what? I want a lot of noise right at the beginning, and then I want it to kind of go away. So I want a little attacky sound. I can drag envelope 3 here to level. Let's see what happens here. I'm just making this up as I go right here. And I'm just going to give it a short attack and see if I can't get a little bit of noise in there. Maybe pink noise instead. And I can route that noise through that filter, right? That sounds terrible. Don't do that. Now I've got a little bit of noise in here. Like I said, not a real fan of that. I've got a sub waveform that is actually higher, so it's not really a sub, it's 2 octaves higher. I can add a second oscillator in here. I can maybe detune it a little bit. And you hear that we start to get some of that chorusing effect. I can maybe add some additional voices to it. I could move it up an octave. Move it down an octave. I could change the waveform on it. So now I've created a PCM square wave that's an octave lower. It's not being filtered, and I could run it through the filter. Or not, right? I can decide. Maybe the sound is getting more complex, right? Now I've got 4 different oscillators going on in it at once, right? So those are some ways that you can thicken the sound, is by adding in oscillators. Now, an important part of the lead sound is also how the notes interact with each other. And we're going to finally jump down to this area down here. We're going to talk about mono, legato, and portamento. Mono means it only plays one note at a time, and that's fine for what we're doing, because the notes aren't overlapping. If I had this note going right here, this would be a chord, right? And if I had mono off, you'll hear these 2 notes play at the same time. You hear that overlapping there? But if I had mono on, only one. It actually jumped back down to that F there, okay? So that's what mono does, and mono is important in lead and bass instruments because you usually don't want more than one instrument playing at a time. Okay, so mono makes it play one note at a time, but we want to start to control how it's going to move between these notes. And to do that, we're going to use a combination of mono, legato, and this portamento. Legato is whether the new note that's shown here will actually start over the envelope, or whether it will be continuous as part of the last sound. And then this portamento means how will it slide between the two. Now, being able to control these three things in relationship with the notes is one of the primary skills in developing a lead sound. So let me go back to this here where we had the mono. Now watch what happens if I turn up this portamento. What you're going to hear is, because this note is still there, it's going to bend up here and it's going to bend down here. And maybe I would just want to shorten it a little bit there, but I can start to create some of those interesting effects, right? In fact, if I shorten this note just a little bit here, you'll hear it start to bend down to that one. I might want to reduce the amount of time there. Okay, so if we start to overlap notes, you'll hear the bend, each note that's overlapped. And maybe if I want that one to bend there, right? You hear how it's starting to sound more natural, right? Now, another thing you can do if you put on this always is the note will always bend. Even the new note, the repeated note bends. And you can turn up that portamento, make it really ridiculous. And we hear that sound a lot, right? That's very common. Legato, if you turn on legato now, it won't re-trigger this note, so you'll just hear it bend smoothly where the ones are overlapping. Re-trigger there, right? So maybe I want it to be legato to that first note and then re-trigger when it hits that note. It sounds like a little bit. And maybe I want it to re-trigger on that one too, right? The skill of mono, legato, portamento, and then changing your note length is really important. And then we can start to throw in things like pitch bend, right? So let's say if we come in here and we put in some pitch bend, you know, maybe we have a kind of drastic pitch bend at the end of that last note to bring it down, right? Maybe we bend way into that first note. Now we're sort of bending in already with the portamento, right? It's starting to sound a little bit more like a human voice, if that makes sense. We're starting to get, you know, more of that kind of bendy sound that we have between the words when we're speaking in our throat. So there's an example of how you might create a lead sound. Again, we're thickening the sound with multiple oscillators. We're still using our filter like we've been using. And then we're bringing in this idea of the mono, legato, and portamento, and maybe adding some MIDI continuous controller information on the right. Believe it or not, even though that sounds a little cheesy right now, when I start adding effects on that, it will really fill it out. And we're going to get into that in the next part of this class. Now that we've got our main parts of our song synthesized, we got the lead, the accompaniment. In the accompaniment, we had pads and plucks. And then we had a nice 808 bass sound. And then we programmed in our own drum set, which is pretty cool. Now let's try adding just some very basic effects. And we're just going to add some risers and fallers. And we can have two different kinds of risers and fallers. One is a frequency riser and faller, which is more of a sweep across the frequency spectrum. And the other is a pitch riser or faller. So I've created a couple tracks here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into retro synth. And once I'm in retro synth, I'm going to create a single note on the track. So I'm going to just create a long note, and I'm just going to loop through a couple long versions of that note. And I'm going to come over here now, and I'm going to put in just some noise on that, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to try to create a filter sweep across that noise here. So if I hit play at this point, we should just hear some noise. And so this sounds like the full spectrum, frequency spectrum. In fact, we can take a quick look at it right here. You can see it goes the whole frequency. So we want to sweep across that frequency from the low to high. And so what we can do is just turn on our filter right here, and we can set it low. And then we want it to go high. Well, how are we going to make it go high over time? We need to route a modulator to it. And we have these modulators down here to pick. And the only two that we can actually send up there are the envelope and an LFO. Let's try an envelope first. We can set about a 10-second attack on the envelope, and we should hear, if we turn the envelope sensitivity up here, we should hear this frequency go up as the envelope starts left to right. Let's see what happens. Worked pretty well, huh? We want it to just go down, we start high. So you can make some quick risers and fallers just using an envelope. Now, if you want it to be synced more with the song rather than on seconds here, one of the things you can do is use an LFO that's song synced. So why don't we do that? We're going to set the envelope back to 0 here. And most of the time you probably will use an LFO or automation, which we're about to get to. Here I need to turn this wheel thing off. It's a little strange. And let's say we want it to take 2 bars for it to come on. And we've got a couple sawtooths we can look at. So obviously this one, it'll be dropping and this one will be rising. So why don't we do a riser first? And we need to turn up the sensitivity of the LFO. And now when we hit play, we should hear the sound rising as we go up this LFO. Now, unfortunately, this filter doesn't move, so you can't really tell other than with your ears. Here we go. And that was the 2 bars. I could take it up to 4 bars if we wanted to last longer, right? We could reverse that. We could have it go down. So there's a second way you can create a frequency sweep riser or faller. Let's go to a third way, which is probably the most common, and that is to actually use automation. What's the difference between automation and synthesis, you might ask? Automation means that you are programming information to modulate your sounds onto the track itself, not within the synthesizer. So what we can do is we can actually control this filter from the track. And the reason that we probably would use automation in this case is that this is a longer item. It's not lasting a note. It's not lasting a quick bar or two. It's lasting maybe, 4, 6, even 8 bars at times for a riser. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go into automation and I'm going to go into the synthesizer, retro synth filter cutoff. And what I can do is click on that now and I can actually build in a riser. Let's make a nice long one here. It takes a while to go. And you can see that move over here on the right when I move that, right? Moves it a little bit. And now what we're doing is we're controlling from the track level that filter. Now you see it move, which is interesting, right? It's funny, we didn't see it with the LFO or the filter. We might start high, come low, after 4 bars, go back up high, and then we'll listen to this with the rest of the music. Come back in here. So you can hear that noise sweep, both a faller and a riser here. I've done it 3 different ways, with an envelope assigned to the filter, with an LFO assigned to the filter, and with automation. You can take your pick, which is most appropriate for your song. Now the other type of riser or faller would be a pitch-based riser or faller. So what I'm going to do is take that exact same note, I'm going to drag it down, and I'm going to create a new track, put a synthesizer on it, and we'll go to the default. But as you may have guessed, with a pitch-based sweep, we can't just use noise. We have to use actually a note. So what we're going to do is we're going to use like as close to a sine wave as we can get here. We're going to use this triangle wave, and we'll go all the way over to Oscillator 2. Now in this synthesizer, unfortunately, we cannot route the filter envelope to the oscillator. Neither can we route the amplitude envelope. So I can't actually show you an envelope modulating the pitch in this particular synthesizer. If I went into ES2, we could do it more simply. I have just a basic saw wave here, and what I could do is I could route one of these envelopes to it. I could go to pitch, come from, let's say, envelope 2, give it a fair amount here, and I can start it. In this case, it's going to start high and go low because it's going to follow a short attack time. And if I wanted that to go down faster, and this is just like the pitch modulation we had already done on some of our drum sounds. If I wanted to invert that, I could make the attack very slow, right? So here I can use envelope to modulate pitch, and I can route it in the synthesizer right here. Couldn't do that in retro synth. Now let me go back to retro synth. If I come over to the LFO doesn't route directly to the oscillator, but I've got this vibrato thing that does, right? So vibrato really is an LFO that's routed to the oscillator. I can simply pick one of the riser faller ones here. I can make it be very long, like say 4 bars. And then what I have to do is turn up the amount of vibrato is going to happen. Let's see what happens when I hit this. So it went up for 4 bars, and then it's starting over here for 4 bars. I could have it go up and down here, so it's following this triangle. Comes back up. So I had to use vibrato on this synthesizer because it's the way of getting an LFO to the oscillator. Now let me show you probably the more common way that you can use it, which is, again, to use automation. I'll pick a waveform here, and I'll put the note in, and I'll come open automation. The problem is, if I were to start changing one of the frequencies on here, the 50 cents only, the cents only allows me to go a small amount. I can only go halfway between one note and the next. Semitones will let me go a long ways, but what happens in this synthesizer, and you might find in others, is that it will step you through the cents. Listen to what happens if I try to automate the semitones on this oscillator. You see how it's moving there by semitone? That might not be the sound we want. Might want a smoother sound. So a lot of the times what you have to do when you want to automate your pitch of your oscillator is use what's called pitch bend, and most synthesizers come with that. That's some of the continuous controller data that we had talked about earlier in this class. I'm going to go ahead and double click the risers and open it into the edit window right here. And I'm going to show automation down here. And I'm going to select pitch bend. I can click here now. And if I were to play that sound, I just hear it normal. And I can just put in my pitch bends. Let's say we want a 4-bar pitch bend. Start low. And these ranges go 0 to 127. So in this case, it's actually going negative 64 to positive 63 if I wanted to bring this all the way up. Let's try it. And you can hear a rather slow pitch bend. Well, what if you want it to be more dramatic than that? You want more pitch bend. Well, most synthesizers have a pitch bend sensitivity setting that you can pick. In this particular synthesizer, it's into the settings menu right here, and you can say, ooh, how much do you want the bend to go? And say you want it to go an entire octave or even 2 octaves. Now we're going to get some pretty wild pitch bending on that. And we can go the other way on the other one. We could say, keep it on pitch bend. We'll start high and we'll go low. And that should span that same 2-octave range. So we put the automation in here, the continuous controller data, and then we set the sensitivity to it in the synthesizer. We start with the music. So that's how you do it. You can create a frequency riser and faller and a pitch riser and faller, and you can use envelopes, LFOs, or automation to do both. Most of the time I'd recommend using automation, and one of the neat things about this automation is we got into a little bit of continuous controller data right here. It'd be nice if you could just automate the oscillator, and probably some synthesizers you can. In this case, we had to go through pitch bend, and it was a nice opportunity to show you how that works. All right, good luck. I hope this helped your understanding of synthesis.